Dallas Cowboys wide receiver CeeDee Lamb might just be the best receiver in the NFL, but you should trade him away this year in Dynasty. We'll explain why in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. You can listen to me in the Locked On Cowboys podcast, and you can read me at the 33rd Team. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also read her at Behind the Steel Curtain and on Pro Football Focus. On today's show, we're taking a look at three receivers that you should trade away now and sell high before the 2024 NFL season begins. And Kate, let's start with CeeDee Lamb, who you have on this list.
Marcus.
Explain why we should trade him away.
I'm not starting this off. Marcus, when we were prepping today's show, we were throwing out some names here, and you kicked it off with CeeDee Lamb, and my jaw proceeded to fall onto the floor, roll away, and I'm still looking for it. I don't know what to do with this. So I'm going to need you to explain to the listeners, because this is not my take. This is not my take. I'm just going to step back. I'm going to give you the floor. I'm going to let you explain to our precious listeners why they need to trade away CeeDee Lamb, who in weeks 6 through 18 put together literally a complete season, 108 receptions, almost 1,400 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns, almost another 100 rushing yards on the ground, an average over 23 fantasy points per game. Tell the fantasy managers that are listening right now why they should trade away precious CeeDee Lamb, who undoubtedly won them a fantasy championship last year. How?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
All right, a couple of things. Number one, yes, I am a Cowboy fan. Number two, yes, CeeDee Lamb is my favorite player. So I know I am biased here, but this is actually why I think you should move him. First of all, let's talk about the price. He is not only is he wide receiver 2 right now in dynasty leagues, he's the second overall player. Now in Superflex leagues, it goes down a little bit, but you get the point. Like, this is one of the most valuable players in dynasty leagues, and he is at his absolute zenith in terms of his dynasty ability or dynasty value, excuse me. But the reason why I'm thinking it might not be a bad idea to trade him this year is there's just a lot of uncertainty in Dallas, and that makes me a little bit nervous. Let's talk about that potential uncertainty. Number one, Dak Prescott, who CeeDee Lamb has such a connection with Dak. Whenever those two are together, they're absolutely fantastic. But I think every day that goes by that Dak Prescott doesn't sign a contract extension, the more I believe that he's actually going to walk and become a free agent in 2025. Remember, the Dallas Cowboys cannot tag him, so Dak will be an unrestricted free agent. Trey Lance, who I think many people assume would be the quarterback next year, he's also a free agent. And then there's the coaching staff. Mike McCarthy is on the final year of his deal. And I think if the Cowboys don't advance to the championship round of in the NFC, he'll likely be gone. I just think there's a lot of potential changes that could happen next year. You're going to get likely a new coach. There's a chance you get a new quarterback as well. And then on top of that, Kate, I think they're going to try to bring in another receiver at some point next year, because all they have is Brandon Cooks, who's in the final year of his deal. Jake Ferguson is going into year 3. They cut Michael Gallup. Jalen Tolbert will be going into his final year of his contract. I just don't think he's always going to get 200 targets every single year. I think there's going to be some added target competition and unlikely a decrease in quarterback play. So if I can move him now for another receiver that's in the same range and something more, I think I would do it.
I mean, I think all of those are very valid points. I just don't know how easy it is going to be to find a receiver that even comes close to the type of production. You mentioned all the reasons why we shouldn't just take it for granted that CeeDee Lamb is locked into this production moving forward. But I mean, coming off a career high 2.69 yards per route run, average 102.9 receiving yards per game, among wide receivers ranked 7th in fantasy points per target, 3rd in fantasy points per route run. He had 8 games with 100 or more receiving yards from week 6 on.
I know.
You know how many games in that span he had fewer than 50 receiving yards?
One.
He had one. That is, I'm going to be honest, it's just really hard for me to conceivably move on from that type of production. So, what I'm going to need you to do, can you lay out some types of trades? How do you go about trading CeeDee Lamb in your dynasty leagues? Because undoubtedly, there's going to be a massive market. Just as if the Cowboys made it known that CeeDee Lamb is available in the NFL for trade, yeah, if you put CeeDee Lamb on the block, you're going to get a lot of hungry managers. But what kind of deal are you looking for if you're willing to move on?
Assuming you need a wide receiver, this is you're basically trying to piece out CeeDee Lamb. I want another receiver that's somewhere in the top 8 receivers. So like the very bottom of that would be like the Puka Nacua, Garrett Wilson range, and then another additional asset or two that could help me win the trade. So we're actually very fortunate because on Dynasty League football, we've had multiple trades involving CeeDee Lamb in a very similar situation. So the first one would be CeeDee Lamb for AJ Brown, who is currently being drafted as wide receiver 6, pick 113. This is 14-team league. Pick 204, 4th and a 5th round pick. Now, that's not my favorite, but I think that's a trade that makes some sense if you do need to piece out CeeDee Lamb.
Would you trade CeeDee Lamb for Marvin Harrison Jr. straight up?
No.
What do you need if you're targeting? Because I think Marvin Harrison Jr., like if you're going to part ways with CeeDee Lamb, I want a guy with wide receiver 1 upside, right? And that is Marvin Harrison Jr. What would you need to add to that package to make it even?
At least a 1st round pick in next year's draft. I've got another one here, Kate. And this is to me like the type of, we've seen these trades out there. These are the packages that I would be looking to do. CeeDee Lamb and Austin Eckler, which is whatever, for AJ Brown. So you're dropping down from wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 6. George Pickens, who we talked about last week, how we really like him as somebody whose value is going to go up. A 2025 1st round pick and Rashad Bateman. Like those are the type of deals. I get 2 starting receivers, including a number 1 receiver and a 1st round pick next year. I would do that deal.
I would also probably do that deal. And that's somebody who, again, I came into this podcast giving you full range on the floor because I couldn't get on board with the take, but you've convinced me that there is a world where you can conceivably move on from CeeDee Lamb and recoup some value. I'm still going back. If I have CeeDee Lamb, I want a Marvin Harrison Jr. I want
that plus more, right? So,
yeah.
Something else that gets me really excited. So if you're moving down from CeeDee to Marvin Harrison Jr., I need at least a 1st round pick and maybe something else that just helps fill out maybe the top end of my roster. Again, I'm not saying to go out and trade CeeDee Lamb for 80 cents on the dollar, but understand there is a chance that his value could fluctuate a lot over the next 12 months, not from wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 22, but maybe from wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 6. And that could be enough that, I mean, hey, you just lost a 1st round pick of dynasty value. That's why I'm considering moving on from him in the right spot.
If Dak hits free agency, Marcus, what do you mentioned the possibility for fluctuation in CeeDee's dynasty value. If you knew right now that Dak Prescott was going to be a free agent in 2025, guaranteed, where would you be valuing CeeDee Lamb in your dynasty rankings?
Probably like wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6.
Okay. I think that's fair. But like when you have, wide receivers at this top end of the market, right? the difference between wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 6 in terms of like what you're getting back in a trade
Matters.
that can be pretty significant.
Yep. All right, let's talk about another receiver that we're considering moving on from this offseason, and that is DK Metcalf. We will get to him next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer that it gets to tip off, with killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. You can save last minute you can save on last minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, and theater events near you. Save even more on exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. And get this, you can save even more when you choose a section and let Gametime choose your exact seats. It's absolutely fantastic. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We want to let you know that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on the Amazon Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. All right, we are back here discussing 3 receivers that you should try to trade away before the start of the 2024 season in your dynasty leagues. And Kate, let's talk about DK Metcalf for the Seattle Seahawks. If you missed it on last week's show, you and I both agreed that Jackson Smith-Njigba, JSN, has a chance to see a massive increase in his dynasty value. Is that why you're considering moving on from Metcalf?
I'm going to be honest. So there is a part of the evaluation where you look at the potential for JSN. Do I think JSN at this point, given what we've seen from DK Metcalf, has a higher ceiling for fantasy? I'm kind of starting to believe it. And I know DK Metcalf might be one of the biggest mismatches in terms of real life value to your NFL team versus value to your fantasy football team. Looking back in 2023, Marcus, can you guess the number of games that DK Metcalf produced as a wide receiver one? So finished as a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy PPR.
I had him in a lot of leagues. I got to believe the only game was when they played the Cowboys that the week after Thanksgiving. Is that right?
There were actually 2 games.
2 games.
In 2023.
I'm sure that was one of them. Yes.
2 games, Marcus. Do you know how many games you finished as a wide receiver 3 or worse in 2023?
Double digits.
9.
Yeah.
Going back to 2022, he had 3 games as a top 12 wide receiver, 8 games as a wide receiver 3 or worse. I'm going to give you a list of players here that had more games as a top 12 fantasy wide receiver who are being drafted behind DK Metcalf in Dynasty right now. Jordan Addison, Tank Dell,
I love Tank.
George Pickens, Gabe Davis, Rashid Shaheed,
who I
Adam
like quite a bit.
Thielen, Marcus.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I want all of these players ahead of DK Metcalf, but Marcus, the whole point of that exercise was to point out the fact that DK Metcalf, though I think he adds a ton of value to his actual NFL team, hasn't been as productive for fantasy. And I think what we look at and the kind of narrative that surrounds DK Metcalf as a fantasy asset is his very high ceiling. But I mean, I just gave you the stats here. We don't see that high ceiling very often. We don't see it enough to, I think, justify his cost at wide receiver 20. I would rather take DK Metcalf. And let's be honest, it's not like DK Metcalf is a hot name on the trade market right now. But if I can still kind of trade him right now while the consensus is that he is this quote unquote high upside player, I'm going to do it.
So believe it or not, December 2020 and actually into January 2021, DK Metcalf was being drafted as the wide receiver 1 in Dynasty leagues.
Wide
The
receiver 1.
overall wide receiver 1 after his second year. And his dynasty value is pretty steadily declined. Now, some of that is Seattle's had to move on from Russell Wilson, and he was just so efficient with Russell Wilson. And now it's Geno, who I still really like Geno. I think Geno's a good quarterback, but peak Geno still isn't quite as good as what 2019, 2020 Russ is. My concern is that what does the future look like for DK Metcalf in Seattle? Because we both like JSN. We looked at some of Jackson Smith and Jigba's college production. He's coming. Like at some point, he's going to become the focal point of this offense. And DK is going to go back to being the hammer, right? The guy that makes the big plays down the field, but not the receiver that's earning, double-digit targets every
He's not
single
the
game.
possession guy that you go
No,
to on an every down
no.
basis.
I think there's a good chance, even as young as DK Metcalf is, that the value only continues to decrease. And I think there's a chance, Kate, that we just get into the season this year and JSN is out targeting him every single week. Unless there is a change in scenery and he gets traded or somebody else gets moved on this offense, maybe it's Tyler Lockett, I'm with you. I think I'm out.
Yeah, 31st in fantasy points per route run this past season, 34th in fantasy points per target. Now, we did see this Seattle Seahawks offense take a step back, and I know we kind of have to look, especially in Dynasty. I've preached looking at the player and evaluating them over situation, because we have seen, especially in the last 2 or 3 seasons, how rapidly things can change for a given team, and teams are willing to trade their superstars. And we're seeing some mega movement that I don't think anybody expected us to see over the past few years. So I understand that situations can change, but generally speaking, I don't think DK Metcalf has offered enough, but I still think he's got enough name value for me that I'm willing to consider moving on from him, just, to find maybe an asset that I think does have that potential to reach, wide receiver 1 value here again. Whereas I don't know how much I'm going to expect, even if DK Metcalf had a good 2024 season, how much would his dynasty value increase that much? I'm not very sure.
All right. Time to put away like my rational self and be a little bit more tinfoil hat guy here.
You have a
DK
tinfoil hat.
Yeah. DK Metcalf's biggest advocate on the Seahawks was Pete Carroll. And Pete Carroll was willing to put up with some of the other nonsense that happens on the field with DK Metcalf every once in a while. I'm not saying that he's a diva.
He's a little troublemaker. Yeah.
Yeah. On the field, not off the field. We haven't heard a whisper about DK Metcalf off the field. There's just been some times on the field where
he gets a little frustrated.
Yeah. I do wonder, with the change in the coaching staff and maybe the change in the offense, we've heard some rumblings, I think is the best way to put that, rumblings that some teams have maybe been interested in DK Metcalf, maybe even your Pittsburgh Steelers. I do wonder, if he is a receiver that could potentially get moved, maybe not this year, maybe next year, maybe sometime beyond that. And I just always worry about what a receiver is going to look like on a new team. Could he go to a situation where the quarterback play is better? Absolutely. He could also go to a situation where the quarterback play is worse. And I believe it or not, Geno is not. There's certainly 10 or 12 quarterbacks that are worse than Geno Smith every single year. So I think that the 1% chance that happens, or whatever percentage you want to put on it, makes me a little bit more concerned about the long-term value of DK Metcalf, even though I do really like him as a player.
I do think the tinfoil hat theory with DK Metcalf is something worth pointing out, because when the rumors came out that, like the Steelers had called about DK Metcalf, the answer wasn't no.
It's just not right now.
It was just not right now. And Marcus, we just hit the post June 1 era here in the NFL, which means the cap situation for players either being traded or being released changes significantly. So DK Metcalf, prior to the June 1 kind of era, would have saved the Seattle Seahawks just $9.5 million. After June 1, that became $17 million worth of potential savings here for the Seattle Seahawks
Yep.
in 2024. That is why they said not now, but maybe later. And that time has come. I wouldn't be surprised if we did see him on the move as this team just, again, looks toward the future of the organization,
Yep.
new head coach, new era. It's not
We'll see.
inconceivable.
All right, let's talk about Chris Olave, who was a high first-round pick for the Saints. It's produced pretty well in his first 2 seasons. Why are we considering trading him in our dynasty leagues? We'll explain next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and in the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Now that we know that the Celtics and the Mavs are in the NBA Finals, we have all the odds and lines up on FanDuel. Go check them out. I like the Mavs to win in 6 or 7 games. Could they go to Boston and win that game 7? We'll see, but I think those pretty good odds there. Can't wait for the NBA Finals. It's going to be so much fun. So go visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Everydayers, on Wednesday's show, we're going to have Matt Williamson here to answer your Twitter questions as always. So make sure you send them into us at Marcus_Mosher, at Kate Modjuk, and of course, at Williamson NFL. But we're finishing up today's show discussing 3 receivers that you should consider trading this offseason ahead of the 2024 season. And now we've landed on Chris Olave, a personal favorite of mine, one of my favorite players in the league to watch, only 23 years old, the alpha #1 receiver with the Saints. But why should we trade him?
Chris Olave is a really tricky one, but I do want to point out the fact that similar to a guy like DK Metcalf, we have not really seen a fantasy ceiling here for Chris Olave, despite the fact that he has been the undisputed #1 target for his respective offense. Like in terms of opportunity, things couldn't have really gotten any better for Chris Olave over the past 2 seasons. Have they have, some concerns at quarterback? Sure. But you look at, his catchable target rate, just under 72%, which ranks, middle of the pack in terms of wide receiver.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we're not dealing with a Kyle Pitts level of bad quarterback here play. Like Derek Carr, he's produced fantasy wide receivers in the past here, but we just haven't seen it with Chris Olave. And I'm not saying that it's not due to monstrous talent, but I do think that there are some players being drafted in a similar range that might return some higher upside, even if maybe the quality of play doesn't not like necessarily match what we're going to see here from Chris Olave.
It just doesn't deliver enough spike weeks, right? And that's really what you want from your wide receiver one, is to have a baseline level of consistency, right? But to have those games, 3 times a year, 4 times a year, that can carry your squad that week. And I really like Olave, but we just haven't seen that yet. And I do have some concerns about the Saints team in general, right? Like, I think Derek Carr is a fine NFL quarterback, but I have no idea how long he's going to be there. I don't think he's necessarily the type of quarterback that's going to maximize Chris Olave's dynasty value anyways. The offensive line has gotten to be really poor. I think we could see a whole new changing coaching staff after this year as well, which is going to bring even more uncertainty. I like Chris Olave as more of a wide receiver 2, mid-range wide receiver 2, but wide receiver 11, there's just so many receivers that are going after him that just have far more upside.
Do you know how many games in his career over 2 seasons that Chris Olave has finished as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver?
So 1?
0. He has never finished.
0.
Chris Olave has never finished as a top 5 wide receiver in a single given week within his career. I think there is something to be said for a reliable asset that does not lose you a week. But Marcus, I can draft guys who won't quote unquote lose me a week much further down the draft board than I can draft Chris Olave. When I'm in this wide receiver 1 range, or even in the, wide receiver 2 range between wide receiver 12 and wide receiver 24, I'm still looking for league winning upside. And maybe Chris Olave is going to get there because there's no question that he has the talent to get there. But even Garrett Wilson, I think we've seen more of a ceiling with Garrett Wilson, despite catching passes from like the Mike White, Zach Wilson.
So let me give you some trades from courtesy of Dynasty League Footballs, just to show like what the current value is for Chris Olave. So this is in a non-super flex league. Chris Olave for the 104 and the 204.
I'll take the 104 and the 204.
Okay. Super flex league. Chris Olave for Jordan Love.
Jordan Love.
All right, let's get to some more. These are the ones that I really like. Chris Olave straight up for Bijan Robinson.
Oh, Bijan. So easy, Bijan.
Again, Chris Olave straight up for Breece Hall.
Breece Hall.
Yeah. So I think some of those are a little far-fetched, but clearly they're getting done.
But these are real trades that we're pulling.
Real trades in real leagues, real money leagues, right? There's still a perception out there that Chris Olave is going to be a top 5 dynasty fantasy receiver. We just haven't seen it yet. And I just don't think the situation has gotten suddenly better in one off season. And we know the way this goes, Kate. For young receivers, like we'll typically give you 2 years. And as long as you're producing at an adequate level, which Chris Olave certainly has, your dynasty value is going to go up, or it maybe just will maintain. But if there's that third year where you're 1,000 yards, 1,100 yards, 7 or 8 touchdowns, and you're not quite producing at the number 1 wide receiver list, that's when the dynasty value begins to tank. And I just have a strange feeling that that's the situation we're in right now with Chris Olave, where one more good season, quote unquote, good season, is actually going to drop his value.
This is kind of a perfect segue because in last segment, we talked about DK Metcalf. That's kind of the trajectory that DK Metcalf's dynasty value had, right? He's never had a season with fewer than 900 receiving yards. Great. I love that floor. He's never had fewer than 100 targets in a season. Awesome. Love that. But season over season, as we've continued to see the lack of perceived upside, you saw DK Metcalf's value fall from, the former wide receiver 1 overall to now being drafted at wide receiver 20. And it's not,
he's only 26. DK Metcalf's only 26. It's not like he's 29 or 30 years old.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of the fair point to say that, this kind of perceived ceiling, if we have another year where we don't see that ceiling come to fruition, there is a risk that maybe Chris Olave starts to fall down the ranks, maybe even if it's wide receiver 15, wide receiver 18, that is a significant amount of compensation that you're going to be losing out on. It just depends. Are you okay losing out on Chris Olave? Should he reach his potential here in 2024? You have to make that decision before you trade him away, but it's worth the conversation.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Again, every day is on tomorrow's show. We'll be back with Matt Williamson answering your Twitter questions. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. It streams 24/7 on YouTube or on the Free Fire TV channels app. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Bajuk. Make sure that you read her at Pro Football Focus, one of the absolute best fantasy minds out there. I'm at Marcus_Mosher. You can read me at the 33rd team, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.